Well, hello. It's so nice to have you here, Mary. I have been a very big fan of yours. I'm a bit embarrassed to say it, but when I started my account, The Tin Men, I used to give out an award called the Tin Heart Award to certain people that I felt had done exceptionally important work for men and boys. I gave one to Erin Pitsey, I gave one to Elle Silverman, I gave one to James Timpson, who's now the Minister of Prisons, and I gave one to you.
That's
So
amazing. How come I didn't even know about that? I mean,
I don't know. Well, this is when I was a tiny little 1,000 follower sort of account, and I really want to give an extra level of appreciation to certain people, and I gave yours for your work for boys in education. So I'm a bit embarrassed to say that, and I mean, I would just love to just get straight into it. Like, what is the boy-girl gap that I keep hearing so much about in education?
gosh, well, that's like the whole question, isn't it? And so I first started noticing it when I was chief exec of UCAS. One of the great joys of that job was that, of course, I was sitting on an incredibly powerful set of data because we had people's UCAS applications with all their qualifications, their education background, and the decisions they made about higher education and where they went and so on, going back years. So I started kind of digging into it, and then after that, I started to, whenever UCAS put out a press release about the latest data on how many people had applied or who'd got in or what was happening in clearing or whatever, I would always kind of pick out the stats about male versus female. And it soon became clear to me that, so, even if you don't think it's necessary, and clearly it's not for everyone to go to university, but if you think of the participation rates in higher education as being a proxy for the sort of cumulative disadvantage or advantage through the whole education system, that's quite a good way of coming at it. You might or might not care about who goes to university and who doesn't. But actually, when you look at what happens to boys versus girls, going right back to early years, the gaps start in early years and then they just accumulate through Key Stage 1, Key Stage 2, Key Stage 3, GCSEs, and A levels. So I started just sort of getting a bit more familiar with all of that and, really found it quite shocking. So George, what really interests me about this is different. What's so interesting about the gap between the sexes is it's not like other gaps we know about, like between rich and poor or north and south or independent schools versus maintained schools. It's not like that at all because boys and girls are brought up in the same families, in the same communities, in the same level of relative poverty or advantage. They go to the same schools. They follow the same curriculum. They have the same teachers, and yet these gaps exist. So this is something different. We know we can kind of hazard guesses about why rich people do better than poor people, or why there are more gaps in the northeast than in London, or whatever. There's a kind of a whole lots of kind of environmental reasons why those gaps exist. But for boys and girls, it just doesn't make any sense. And it's always astonished me and actually shocked me that nobody's interested. Do you know what happened to me the other day? I was doing a round table with a bunch of really quite senior people, sort of chairs and directors from FTSE 100 companies and so on. And I mentioned this boys and girls thing, and thinking that would be something of interest that might get picked up in the conversation. And the only person who picked it up said, "Oh, I'm not into doing Hunger Games for who's doing the worst. I'm not going to play Hunger
Wow.
Games for who's doing the worst."
And I come across that all the time because I speak about quite controversial things like domestic violence, probably the most controversial. But when I hear people like you telling me stories, I'm like, we're talking about children here.
I know.
We're talking about kids. Like every child does. I mean, I'm against private schools because I believe every child deserves the right to equal education and based on merit. And you make a really interesting point where all the controls are already in place. Really, like you've got a boy and a girl, same family, same area, same school, same teacher, same class often, and the girl does significantly better. And it's so, I mean, like you said, I don't agree with the class divide, but it's strange how we talk about the class divide but we don't talk about the gender divide. And in fact, whenever I hear the class divide being talked about on the radio at the end of every single academic year, I'm like, really, you're talking about the boy-girl divide there? Because most of that class divide is the boy-girl divide.
Yeah, that's so right. Yeah, that's so right. If you fixed the difference between boys and girls, you would fix a huge chunk of all the other gaps that exist, because they're so big. They're so big.
I've seen you say that in a few years, the boy-girl divide will eclipse the class divide in UK education. Do you think that's still true?
Well, I have to say that I said that when I had some very clever people doing data and analysis for me. So I believed it then, and I haven't got those access to the same people doing the hard yards for me. But what I do know is that since I was at UCAS, which is now 7.5 years ago, when I had access to the data, nothing much has changed. The data have, they've kind of steadied a bit or got a tiny bit better or a tiny bit worse, but the gaps are all still there. So I'm I'm guessing that probably is still true, but I couldn't put my hand on my heart. But it's, it what that does is it kind of sizes, it's a sort of, is this a small, medium, large, or extra large problem? And I'd say it's an extra large problem, and nobody's treating it like that.
This is where how I got into this space. Well, I couldn't. I sounds like I had the same realization as you. I was like, look how big of a problem this is. I'm seeing people on Instagram complain about how men have more pockets than women and things like that, and I'm like, yeah, but fine. But boys are behind in every stage of education in the UK and have been for my entire life, so more than 3 decades. And no one cares. And I'm seeing people like you doing incredible work as the boss of UCAS, the chief executive. And like, there is no greater authority, in my opinion. And you're ringing the bell, you're ringing the alarm bell, and people still don't do anything about it. So I guess that's where the difference is in terms of all the different divides. Like, we don't care. I mean, I read a research recently that found that 93% of British public have no idea that women are so far ahead of men in university.
But do you know what? Whenever I mention it in public, if I'm giving a talk or something, whenever I mention it, after the talk, I'm surrounded by mums who come and say, "This is so true. My sons are behind. They're different. They're not being looked after properly." So I think out there it's people's lived experience, as they say, that boys are getting left behind or somehow not being served well enough by the education system. When I talked about that sort of cumulative disadvantage, and you end up basically with 30,000 fewer young men doing A levels than young women, and then that translates into university progression. And that's because they don't get as good GCSEs, and they don't get as good GCSEs because they're going, all the stages they're dropping behind. And I think there's a real case for looking at what I think is commonly known as stage, not age. So you kind of bundle everyone up because they happen to be born in whatever month in whatever year, and you say, right, you're in year 1, you're in year 2, based on your birthday. And then kids get left behind, but they still go up to year 3 or year 4 or whatever it is, even though they're behind. And you just think, this doesn't make sense. Nobody asks you to do piano grade 3 if you've failed grade 2, do they?
Yeah.
I read somewhere, maybe you sent me something, but I read somewhere that in some areas, I think in the US, a lot of families are choosing to make their sons wait a year before starting school. Was it you sent me that?
Yeah, I mean, that's an idea that Richard Reeves presents often, highly controversial.
Okay.
I think that really splits people. It's called red shirting. And the idea is
that's
that
right. Yeah.
a boy should be held back for a year because his cognitive development is delayed. And it's that I can see it both ways. I can see why Richard wants to do that, but I can see why you're not really fixing the problem.
Red shirting is such an ugly term as well. Yeah, I don't think you should hold them back. You should just do something different.
Yeah,
with
change
them.
the school.
If they're not ready to to access the curriculum that girls can access at the same age, then they should be given a different curriculum. Obviously, that's difficult and expensive to do. But
it's expensive, but the long term return on that is you're basically enhancing the education of 50% of the population. So any amount of money you spend on that is going to be paid back tenfold long term, surely.
And I don't see why schools can't grasp this issue. By the way, they all measure it. I'm a trustee at a multi-academy trust, and I've been school governor and on and off it, for many, many years. When you get the pupil achievement stats, it's always broken down by male and female, but nobody takes any account of the gap.
Just to quickly cover off the whole redshirting thing, I'd love to hear your opinion just intuitively on the idea of boys being held back or having the option of holding boys back for a year. How does that sit with you as the former UCAS boss?
Well, I mean, you said it there. Boys are not doing so well. Why on earth would we hold them back? It's not they need to be held back. It needs a slightly different approach to pedagogy and curriculum to make sure that they don't fall behind, or even maybe they go slower at some stages and faster at others, and end up in the same place as their sisters and female peers. But yeah, I think I don't think I would ever say boys should be held back and that's going to somehow cure everything. That doesn't sound right to me at all.
No, well, I mean, I consider myself as one of the boys that didn't do very well. I mean, I'm happy to share my grades with you. I got 3 Ds in A level, which is just like a fail. But I don't think that was a true representation of my intelligence. And I prefer to see it as the schooling system failed me rather than I failed school.
Exactly.
And that's the problem. That's the issue. You're sort of pointing the finger in the wrong direction by blaming boys for not being emotionally or mentally mature enough. And I was like, well, then change the system. Don't expect boys to change.
We have a kind of a mass education system, a national curriculum, national assessment styles, and the reality is that doesn't suit anyone. And so you've got to make sure that there are other pathways for people who think differently, learn differently, behave differently. Incidentally, I left school at 16 and didn't go to university till I was in my early 40s. So, and I definitely regard that as the school's failure, not mine, in retrospect.
We've talked a little bit about where are boys behind, and it is an easy answer because they're behind at every stage. But why are boys behind?
Well, this is where I'm not the best person to ask because I'm not an educator and I'm not an academic. Yeah, I mean, probably the most convincing evidence that I've seen is that it's about boys' typically lower levels of literacy and appetite for reading. That seems to be the kind of underlying factor, and it kind of makes sense. I mean, if you can't read, you can't access curriculum. You can't read what's on the board. You can't read the books you're set. Those fundamental levels of literacy are probably at the root of it. But I'd point to a couple of other things. Something like only 35% of secondary school teachers are male, and only 14% of primary teachers are male. And I imagine that's vanishingly near zero for early years education. And apparently nearly a quarter of all state schools in this country, primary and secondary, nearly a quarter of them have got no male classroom teachers. Now, right across the kind of feminist women equalities for women agenda is this whole thing about role models. We need role models for women in science. We need role models for women in engineering. We need role models for women in the workplace. We need women on the board of FTSE 100 companies, etc., to be role models. We need women presidents and prime ministers, ministers and so on. So, I mean, if role models are so important to young women, why on earth wouldn't they be important to young men?
So, greater literacy is a great idea. Especially in earlier years, and more male teachers. My primary school was one of the primary schools you talked about. We only had one male teacher, and he lasted 1 year and he was gone again. And no prize for guessing who my favorite teacher was because it was him, and then he was gone. And I mean, it's not just me. I feel like a lot of men in school, for example, that they're a lot less likely to problematize boys' behavior. And I was one of those boys. I mean, I acted up, I misbehaved, I was cheeky, but I don't necessarily think that indicates I was a naughty boy. It just indicates I was disengaged, not interested, bored.
Some really, really alarming stories, and I think maybe some stats as well about how men, particularly wanting to go into primary and early years teaching, feel that they'll be labelled as sort of like a paedophile or something.
Yeah. I mean,
that's pretty shocking too.
Well, that was my next question. Like, how do we get more men in teaching? Do you think the school system is hostile to male teachers? And do you think that's part of the reason why there aren't as many men teaching as women? And if not that, what other things are keeping men out of classrooms in a teaching capacity?
It's still this whole role model thing, isn't it? When did you last see a campaign to get men into not just teaching, but nursing, social work, more of the caring professions? It's all this very kind of gendered view of careers and career outcomes. So you get this sort of self-perpetuating cycle that women have always done these jobs, therefore more women do them and fewer men do them. But, by the way, meanwhile, women are, there are more women becoming lawyers, doctors, dentists, vets, all sorts of professions are gradually turning female. It's actually all about education, isn't it? And role modeling. But unless we have some iconic people kind of speaking up and inspiring young men, it's not going to change very much, is it?
There's the flip side of talking about how important men are in classrooms is also talking about the slightly controversial area of teacher grading bias, where if you have 80% women in classrooms, there's the flip side of that where they actually grade girls. They seem to grade girls higher for the same work and punish boys more for the same behavior. I mean, what can you tell me about that sort of thing?
Well, I'm less worried about it in the kind of exam system because, the person who's actually marking at a question level, not a whole paper level either. They don't know who that person is or whether they're male or female. So I'm not worried about it there. But I was really interested when I looked into at A level, the grade inflation during the COVID, the 2 years when there were no exams. And it was clear that in practically every subject, the amount by which the grades had inflated for young women was far higher than for young men. And I did pose the question, is there some kind of systemic bias here, which obviously a lot of people were very cross with me about that. But and I'm like, fine, there may not be systemic bias, but please come up with another explanation. Was it that boys were much worse affected by COVID lockdowns and the sort of privations of our kind of smaller lives during that time? Maybe that was true as well, but I wondered why nobody thought it was important to understand that.
So just to summarise what you said, that over in the UK, at least during lockdown, all exams were cancelled and grades for A-levels were based on teacher assessments. And whilst young men and young women all benefited from that in terms of getting higher grades, the inflation that young women received is significantly higher and across the board, suggesting that when we lean more into teacher assessments rather than objective exams, there is some sort of bias, potentially a systemic bias, that is just marking boys down with the same cognitive ability.
Yeah, possibly. Maybe that's true and maybe it's not, but I just felt like with such a big difference, why didn't somebody feel it was important to understand why? We might have learned something.
Well, that's what the problem. There's so many questions and so few answers.
By the way, I don't think any teacher, whether they're male or female, I don't think any of them kind of get up and go to work and think I'm going to give the girls a boost and I'm going to keep the boys down. It just isn't like that. I mean, all the teachers I meet are just so committed and so professional and really care about what they're doing and what the outcomes are for their kids.
I mean, I'm always happy to see that too. I don't think any teacher's doing it intentionally. it's a bit like a subconscious thing where if you have a like you said, like a company where 80% of the board directors are male, that is like naturally going to lead to an environment where men working in that company are advantaged. But I don't think this board directors are doing it on purpose. I think it's just men see things slightly different to women, and women see things slightly different to men, and that's just a subconscious thing, generally speaking.
Yeah, I think it was OECD analysis that found clear evidence of grading bias against boys. But interestingly, in fact, they found that was just as prevalent from male teachers as it was from female teachers. Yeah.
Yeah, and they put that down to non-cognitive abilities, right? They was basically saying that boys are naughtier, they don't hand in their homework, they're late to class, they misbehave, and that. But they're just as smart as girls, but they misbehave, which makes me wonder. As one of those boys, I don't think I was misbehaving. I was just reacting to a system of education that didn't seem to be attuned to what I wanted or my behaviour.
Yeah.
I read that OECD study too. It's fascinating.
Yeah.
I want to bring it back to just why do so few people seem to care about this? Like, I mean, a lot of people don't know, but and also a lot of people do know, but don't seem to care or just don't see it in the same way. I'm gonna quote you again, if that's okay. You asked it. You said there's a deafening policy silence on the issue. Has the women's movement now become so normalized that we cannot conceive of needing to take positive action to secure equal education outcome for boys? So, what did he mean by that?
I think it's tricky. We have a women and equalities minister, not just an equalities minister.
Mm,
Clearly, women have been, over not just decades but centuries,
mm,
millennia even. Women have been, oppressed or not regarded equally to their menfolk.
mm,
And there's a huge amount of societal catch up to do on that, and hence the feminist movement. So I think
mm,
it's quite politically charged, but I think it really does matter, for that large kind of underclass of young men coming out of compulsory education with very low or no qualifications, and it matters because they're then much more likely to be unemployed and to be unemployed for longer. I think men with no qualifications are something like 1.7 times more likely to be unemployed than
mm.
women with no qualifications.
Wow.
And where people have two A levels or equivalent, there's virtually no gender gap in the unemployment rates. And so then, if these poorly educated men are employed, they're much more likely to work in, I don't know, sort of hazardous or menial or dead end type roles, and
Mm,
then that makes them more likely to not look after their mental and physical health, and then you get more substance abuse, smoking and drinking, lower life expectancy, much higher rates of going to prison, and much higher rates of death by suicide. I read somewhere that nearly a quarter of parents think that boys in their child's school are made to feel ashamed of being male.
mm,
And a large proportion, nearly half of children, have been taught that young men are a kind of a problem in society. We've got this awful, especially at my age, this awful term, male, pale, and stale. I just can't understand why it's tolerated and not called out for being really I hate it when men of my generation call themselves out as male, pale, and stale as a sort of somehow trying to kind of show that they're not entitled and that they realize that they're somehow privileged. So I think it really, really matters, and it matters because a huge minority of men and boys are unnecessarily underachieving in education, and of course then they go on to crowd out our justice system, crowd out our prisons, um, and the our narratives about masculinity and continuing the fight for equality, which I think has moved from being in the workplace to actually being in the home and the family, are completely undermined. Every Me Too moment, every high-profile violent abuse case by men against women, every Priapic MP, every Andrew Tate fan, they all reinforce the narrative that men are not worth investing in. And I just think that unless we invest in boys and men, we'll have a growing societal problem of men just being unable to engage in a kind of democratic, equal, law-abiding society and indeed a fulfilling life.
It wouldn't surprise you to say that I'm very politically engaged, and I voted at every single election in my entire adult life. And this is the first election where I went and supported the ballot. I went down and just scribbled over my ballot paper.
Oh, did you?
And I was like,
That's
none of
interesting.
you offer anything for me. I still want to vote, show I'm active, but I'm not giving my vote to anyone. And I mean, I think I'm not the only one. There's a lot of young men, especially on the left, that are just like, until I see something for me, and until I see these even just acknowledged, just the gap acknowledged, you don't have to necessarily address it, then I won't be voting. You talked about male, pale and stale, and if this conversation had to get more controversial, it certainly would do by bringing in the fact that white working class boys are even more disadvantaged in many ways. I often look at data and it finds that the very bottom of the sort of achievement ladder are working class white boys. So if it's unpopular to say boys are behind, surely it's even more unpopular to say white working class boys are behind. So what's happening there?
Yeah, it's really interesting that, because it always used to be that black boys were the kind of lowest achieving group, but certainly when you looked at university progression, and so therefore it would have existed earlier. They've kind of soared ahead, and as you say, white working class boys are the lowest achieving, except I think for Gypsy and Roma children and indeed boys. Obviously, that's a very, very small population. So, actually, if you're black, you're much more likely to be poor, statistically. If you're white and poor, you're much more likely to be doing really badly in education. And we see it in the the regional stats, which actually I think Bridget Phillipson, the Secretary of State, has been talking about. Because London does so well on because top of the leagues on pretty much all education outcomes, and then you look at something like the Northeast or the Southwest and see that it's much worse, and it's nearly always in areas where there's a predominant, very, very strongly white population, often rural and coastal as well. And we said earlier, didn't we, that if you fix the boy-girl gap, you'd fix the a lot of other gaps, and I think that's definitely one of them.
You just can't avoid how unpopular that is. If I were to go to some sort of gender equality protest with a sign saying, let's support white boys, I'd probably get pelted with eggs immediately. And that's the problem. I mean, it's a great example of that happening where Stormzy donated millions of pounds to help black boys get into private schools.
Oh, I saw that. Yeah,
good for him. And then a few years later, I think Sir Brian Thwaites did the same for working class white boys who are even, like you said, lower. And then people were turning the money down. Schools were like, I'm not accepting that, too politically unpopular. Caused an absolute outrage. So Stormzy giving millions to working class black boys. We love that. Sir Brian Thwaites doing the same for working class white boys who are arguably even more in need. That's horrendous. And like you said, you're just coming up against this sort of cognitive dissonance that is really hurting children, especially boys, especially white boys.
It's about socio-demographic issues as well. If you think about somewhere like the Northeast, deindustrialized, generations of high unemployment, few male role models in the community, let alone in school. And it's not very surprising that population of boys has fallen so far behind, but of course they have fallen further behind than the girls in those populations, which is kind of back to where we started from.
I want to ask you about something you talked about in terms of like men leaving school with lower education and how that has like a negative impact on the rest of their life. I wonder, and that's really important because it does, like I said earlier, it's lower education is like a really important common denominator to so many social issues, like you said, incarceration, suicide, mental health, life expectancy, health in general, etc. But I wonder whether that could go further. And let's take like a hypothetical boy who's illiterate in school, grows up, graduates with lower literacy than female students. That boy becomes a man, has a child. Do you think in the same way that a lack of men in classrooms is perpetuating the cycle, perhaps a greater number of illiterate fathers who would otherwise be, reading books to their boys and not problematizing their behavior? Do you think that could be a problem where it's like a cycle of illiteracy between father and son, between the generations? Do you think that is an issue worth discussing?
Straight answer is I don't know, but it's kind of adjacent to another issue, which is the rise in single parent families, which are predominantly female. It's usually the mum who's the single parent, not the dad. And the numbers of young people, both obviously boys and girls, growing up in without a father figure around or engaged or supporting them is getting higher and higher, and that feels to me like a problem actually for girls as well as boys. But if they haven't got the role models in school, and then they haven't got the role models at home either. I mean, it's just generational illiteracy. I could imagine that could be an issue, but it's never come on my radar so far.
I guess I'm just thinking about the stereotypical image of a parent reading to their child. I think of like a mother reading to her daughter. I don't necessarily think of a dad reading to the son. And I would not be surprised if that was actually reflected in reality.
That's probably true. Although I think it is getting better. I think, my kids are in their 30s now, and they've come a long way. But I think even the next generation down, kids in their teens and 20s now, that it's so different. Their attitudes to family life and kind of equal participation in family and society, I think that is changing.
I can personally relate. I was on a family holiday just last week, and I was reading to my niece at bedtime. So I'm more than happy to do that, and I'm amazed at how smart she is.
But like you were saying about the dad who's doing the caring, or is a single dad who nobody talks to him outside the school gates, and we've it comes back to, George, doesn't it? The whole issue that we're talking about. I think unless we educate boys and young men, they're not going to contribute in a meaningful way to creating a more equal society. And then this divide between of haves and have-nots, and the boys and men being kind of at the bottom of the pile when they've got low education outcomes is just going to get exacerbated.
Absolutely. And and you're right to widen it to like a societal level, because it's not just in classrooms where boys lack these male role models, it's at home as well. I remember doing a graph where I did a big square of like, this square represents all the boys in America. A quarter of those boys have no dad at home, so 25%. That goes up to 50% for mothers under 30, 50%. So let's go over a quarter. I was like, of these boys, which represents, tens of millions of boys in America, 80% of them won't have a male teacher either. So there's a huge contingent of boys, no father at home, no male teacher at school, or in the classroom, or at school entirely. And if you look at the correlations between that and many of the sort of harmful societal outcomes, especially on like violent crime, like so many of them come from those, like the fatherless boys, the boys without male role models. And it's where it interweaves more widely. I'm going to give you a bit of a change in direction. One of the things I wanted to ask you about is STEM, the idea of STEM. And I'm told things like 35% of students studying STEM are women, so a massive gender gap. But then I'll go on UCAS and I'll look at STEM subjects, and the actual UCAS classification of STEM is far broader. I can read it to you. I'm sure you know it already, but medicine, dentistry, subjects allied to medicine, biology, sports science, psychology, veterinary science, agriculture, physical science, mathematics, geography, architecture, computing, engineering, technology. And if you add all those together, UCAS tells us that there are actually more women studying STEM, 701,000 versus 594,000 men studying.
Yeah, and that's because they've included things like subjects allied to medicine, which is massively biased towards female, psychology ditto, and there was one other, biology, same thing.
So people that say 35% of STEM students are female, are they basically saying biology isn't a science, medicine isn't a science? Is that because that doesn't make sense either?
Is that in university or in school?
University.
So if you look at A-level preferences, you've definitely got a small number of subjects where boys are overrepresented. So maths, physics, chemistry, not biology, computer science. I think that's probably it. And actually, the very small improvements, and we haven't had the final end of cycle data from UCAS yet this year, but it sounds like there's possibly a very small improvement in the gap between male and female, and that could be because of this, the rising popularity of things like computer science and mathematics, which are kind of more boy subjects. I just wish they weren't so gendered, these subjects. It's just so I think you're absolutely right. When you look at STEM analysis, I mean, geography being STEM, that doesn't sound quite right. Geography is normally a social science rather than
people struggle to call nursing. People don't think nursing's a science, but I'm like, if anyone opens a nursing handbook, that's exactly what you're going to see. It's just science.
Yeah. And actually, I think this sort of bifurcation between STEM and non-STEM is really unhelpful. And it feels like, successive governments have, really emphasized how important we need more technicians and engineers and and digital skills. And I think it's really unhelpful because, well, goodness me, you're in the creative sector, but I'm betting that the kind of technology skills that you deploy as you do your work are right up there as well as your creative skills.
Yeah, it's sort of doing more work than I am now, especially with generative AI. It's absolutely incredible. So thankfully, I'm quite literate. My last question for you, Mary, and thank you for being so generous with your time, is what can we do going forwards? Like, parents are probably going to be reading this, being like, okay, well, listen to this, and I want to help. What do I do for my boys to close this gap? Because it doesn't sound like the government are going to do much because of deafening policy silence, as you said. But what can we do, like parents?
Yeah, I think raise the issue at school. Look at the data from your school to see the difference between boys and girls' achievements. Lobby government to at least put gender gaps in the accountability measures so that that's something that every school is working towards, is actively working towards reducing, assuming they know the answers. I definitely don't know what it is they should be doing. Yeah, so keep running it up the flagpole, really, because I genuinely believe that if we don't do this, it'll have a negative impact on the advances we can make to a more equal society. So I think it's as important for women that men should be educated as it is for men that they should be educated.
And perhaps most importantly, read to your boys. Like, read books to them, get them to read to you, increase that literacy. If that's the underlying factor, that's something we can all do.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's a really great note to end on. Read to your boys.
Read to your boys starting tonight, and don't accept any computer games until then. So where can we find out more about you? Can we read more about your work? Is there a website or a Twitter account we can follow?
Do you know, I've got a website that I've set up and never turned into a website. I keep paying the fees for it every year, and one of these days I'll turn it in. But yeah, LinkedIn is probably the place to find out most about me.
Well, thank you, Mary, for your time, and it's been so enlightening and a real honor.
Yeah, it's so great to meet you, and thanks for taking the time to have this conversation. So important.
Thank you so much.